Welcome back. This is video number 5 in a series where we talk through our complete process for creating Ultimate Frisbee highlight videos. There's links in the description to all of the other videos if you want to jump around or watch them from the start. In this video, we'll be talking about how we film Ultimate Frisbee highlights. Before we can start filming, we need to set up our camera and our tripod. And before we do that, we need to figure out where we're going to set up. There are a few things to consider when picking a spot to set up your tripod. Firstly, think about where on the sideline you want to set up. You can either film from one of the sidelines or you can film from behind one of the end zones. Filming from the sideline at halfway means that you are the closest you can be to every point on the field without being on the field. So that might be a good option if you don't have a particularly powerful zoom lens. However, if you're filming from the middle, the footage tends to be pretty whippy. For example, if you're filming from the middle and someone hucks it from their half of the field toward the end zone, you have to whip the camera around to capture the catch. This can make the footage a little jerky and hard to follow, so we tend to try and avoid filming from the middle of the sideline. One way that we can make our footage a little less whippy is to still film from a sideline but offset ourselves toward one end zone. This means that we're not whipping the camera back and forth as much, and it means that we're still relatively close to the far end zone so that we can zoom in and still keep the players large in the frame. One of my favourite places to film is from the sideline at the front of the end zone on the left. This means not too much whipping, and it's still relatively close to all points on the field, and it means that whenever a right-handed player pulls with a backhand throw, they're facing the camera. This gives footage like this, which I think looks pretty cool. The other place that we can film is from behind an end zone. The disadvantage of doing this is that while we're close to one end zone, we're pretty far away from the other end zone, so you'll need a good zoom lens to bring players from the far end zone closer to the viewer. The advantage of filming from an end zone is that you don't have to whip the camera around at all. When someone throws a huck, instead of whipping the camera, all you really have to do is zoom in or zoom out to capture the receiver. If you're filming from an end zone, I recommend offsetting to one side rather than filming from in the middle, because if you set up in the middle, when an offense runs a vertical stack, everyone will be between you and the disc and you won't be able to see much. If you set up offset to one side, often you will have a much clearer view. Speaking of having a clear view, one major consideration when choosing where to film is people. Sometimes players on the field will get in the way and block the camera, and there's not really much that we can do about that. But what happens more often is that people on the sideline, whether it be players who aren't on the field or spectators, get in our way and block our view. If you're unfamiliar, the rules of Ultimate specify a 3-meter buffer all the way around the field that needs to be kept clear of obstructions, and that includes spectators. However, what the rules specifically say is that the play should not be obstructed by anything within 3 meters of the field. In practice, what this often means is that when the disc is on the sideline, people will move 3 meters away to clear the throwing lane down the sideline. The people on the other side of the field, though, they're not blocking the play at all, so they don't need to be 3 meters away from the sideline. What tends to happen is that people on the sideline, particularly those behind the play, will creep in so that they can all see. That's fine because they aren't obstructing the play, and they'll move if needed, but if we set up behind them, we can't see. This leads to footage like this, which sucks. On some fields, the 3-meter line will be marked out or it will have cones in place, but in my experience that doesn't help much. People will still creep in if they can't see. In this particular example, there was a 3-meter line marked for the players and a 5-meter line marked for the spectators, and my view was still blocked. This is one of the reasons why filming from behind an end zone can be really useful, because often spectators and players will hang out on the two sidelines and will leave the end zones clear. While we're on the topic of the 3-meter line, that definitely applies to us as well. So wherever you set up your tripod, make sure it's at least 3 meters from the field boundary. There are a few other things to consider when choosing where to film from. The direction of sunlight is one. For example, if the sun is low in the sky, the footage might look better filming from one side of the field rather than the other. Another one is wind. If it's particularly windy, then that might mean more of the play happens on one side of the field or more of the points are scored in one end zone. If that's the case, you're probably going to want to put yourself closer to where the action is more likely to be. Rain is another factor to consider. We'll talk more about filming in the rain later in this video, but if it's windy and raining, you're probably going to want to face your camera away from the wind because that means the rain is blowing onto your back rather than into your lens. One other thing to consider is if the opportunity presents itself whether to film from elevation or not. Often you don't have this option, but there have been a few times when I've been able to film from a ridge near the fields or from a club room. This can work really well, and shooting over the top of people's heads means that people can't get in your way. However, in my opinion, it will often make the footage less dynamic and less exciting in some ways. I think this is because filming from field level makes the viewer feel like they're part of the action, and that's taken away when we raise the camera up. That's more of a personal preference though, so if you have the opportunity to film from elevation, I'd encourage you to experiment and see if you like it. After we've picked a spot to film from, it's time to set up our tripod. Try and make sure that your tripod is level. If your tripod has a bubble level on it, definitely use that. Don't assume that the ground is level. I've been caught out by mounds and divots more than I'd like to admit. If you accidentally film footage that's not quite level, you can compensate for it later when you edit, but it's easier to shoot it right to start with. The other thing that will make things nicer for you while filming is to set up your tripod at a good height and make sure that you're comfortable if you possibly can. I like to get my tripod at the right height so that I'm not bending over too much to look at the screen and I'm not reaching up too much to hold the camera and operate the zoom. Depending on how much Ultimate you're filming, you might be spending a lot of time in this position, so it's worthwhile spending time to set things up correctly from the start so that you don't end up with a sore neck or shoulders at the end of the day. Once we've picked a spot and we've set up our tripod, it's time to press that record button and start filming footage for our highlight video. Because we're only making a highlight video, we only really want to record the highlights, right? Well, yes, but unfortunately I haven't figured out how to film only the highlights. Ultimate is just too fast, and often cool stuff happens without any warning at all. Instead, because we don't know when the highlights are going to happen, we need to film everything. That's the only way that I know of to make sure that we're filming when the highlights do happen. Yes, that means that when a team makes 50 dump swing passes back and forth working through an upwind zone, I've got dead boring footage of 50 dump swing passes. But it means that I'm filming when the defense finally gets that cash layout block or when the handler gets antsy and throws the speculator hammer to the zone. What this looks like in practice is me following the disc with the camera. As the disc moves, I'm moving side to side with it and I'm zooming in and out to keep the disc and the players in frame. You want to concentrate on keeping the side to side movement of the camera smooth because that makes the footage easier to look at. Sometimes this can be tough, especially when the disc is moving quickly, but it does get easier with practice. One thing that happens when doing this, which I think is kind of funny, is that you will bite on some fakes. Try not to, but some throwers will throw fakes that are just too good. As well as panning and tilting the camera to keep the play in frame, you're going to need to zoom in and out as the disc moves closer and further away from you. In my opinion, you can get away with being jerky with your zooms as long as you perform your zooms in one motion. One thing that you do want to avoid is to avoid stuttery zooms, which can happen when you have a zoom lens that's a little sticky. Instead, performing the zoom in one motion, jerkier but quicker, looks better in my opinion. On the topic of zooming, you want to make sure that you zoom in the right amount, and this will come with practice. If you're too zoomed in, it's harder to track the place so you can miss stuff, like here where I barely caught this huge layout because I was too zoomed in. If you're too zoomed out, it's easier to keep the play in frame, but the players are smaller in frame and the play doesn't look as good. Having said that, don't be afraid to zoom out to help you keep the disc in frame or zoom out if you lose the disc. One thing that I do very often is zooming out when I see a player winding up to throw a huck toward me. Chances are I'll need to zoom out anyway because the disc is going to be moving closer to me and it helps me keep track of what's going on. On that note, when hucks do go up, you have two choices. You can either track the disc as it flies through the air or you can track the receiver. There's no right or wrong answer, but generally my preference is to try and track the receiver, because if someone is going to lay out for the score, it generally looks better if we see them throughout the layout rather than tracking the disc and seeing the receiver come into frame mid-layout. That's not always the best thing to do though. It will depend a bit on where you set up relative to the thrower and receiver, and where the huck is going, and probably your personal preference as well. If you're trying to track the receiver, try and follow the right receiver. It sounds obvious, but you don't want to end up with footage like this where I was gearing up to film a massive play only to find that the massive play happened over here. While we're talking about capturing receivers, I want to talk for a moment about framing. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this, but as a general rule, I think that if someone is going to jump up for the disc or jump sideways for a layout, I'll try and frame things up so that I capture more of their body so that they have room to move into the frame. For example, if I'm tracking a disc and I think that someone might lay out from the left-hand side of the frame toward the disc, I'll put the disc on the right-hand side of the frame so that when the player is mid-layout, I capture as much of them as possible. If I'm tracking a receiver and I think that they're about to jump up, I'll tilt the camera up slightly so that I have room to jump into the frame. If I forget to do this, often I'll end up with footage where the players jump up and their hands, sometimes even their heads, move out of frame, and then they fall back down into the frame, one of them has the disc. Footage like this is basically unusable, so I always try and frame things correctly. This also applies when filming throwers. If I think that someone is going to throw in a particular direction, I'll frame them up so that they're throwing into the frame. This, in my opinion, looks better, and it also makes the disc easier to track once they do throw it. The last thing that I'd like to mention about filming Ultimate gameplay is that we should try and be as smooth as possible. A lot of the time we're zooming in lots, which means that any small movements of the camera can be amplified into large camera shake. The fluidized tripod head that we talked about in video 2 will be useful for this, but a lot of it comes down to us being careful and deliberate with our movements. At least that's what I try and do. Ultimate can be a really fast sport, and so often my best efforts at keeping the camera steady go out the window once the disc starts moving fast. But it is really important to try and film smooth footage, otherwise our finished video will look too shaky. One thing that helps with this, especially if you're starting out, is being a little bit more zoomed out than you think you need to be. While editing the videos you can also apply digital stabilization, but in my experience that's only really good for taking out small amounts of shake. If your footage is too shaky, there's not much that digital stabilization can do. One thing that I figured out while making highlight videos is that highlight videos in the style that we make don't work if they're just a montage of highlights. We'll talk more about this when we talk about our editing process in later videos, but for us to make highlight videos work, we need to capture other footage that's not Ultimate Frisbee gameplay, and we call that footage B-roll. As an aside, the term B-roll comes from back when film cameras took literal rolls of film. In the context of a video like this one you're watching now, the A-roll will be filmed from the main camera, and the B-roll will be filmed from the secondary camera that we're using for cutaways. In the context of our Ultimate videos, the A-roll would be the clips of the highlights, and the B-roll would be everything that's not Ultimate Frisbee gameplay. Aside from B-roll being useful for editorial reasons, I also think that it's a great way to showcase all the other cool stuff that happens around an Ultimate game. All the spirit circles, people having fun on the sideline, the great atmosphere, all that good stuff. Ultimate has a great community of people, and I really love showcasing that through video. So how do we capture B-roll? Well, there's no real right or wrong way to do it. You can capture some B-roll from your tripod with your zoom lens, but I find that I capture the best B-roll when I take the camera off the tripod and get closer to the action. If you're capturing something that happens after the game finishes, for example a spirit circle, because the game is over you don't have to stay off the field, so you can get closer and way more creative with the shots that you capture. B-roll is a great opportunity to get creative with things like camera movement, focus pulls, foreground and background objects, and really anything that you can think of that will give you good looking footage. Like when capturing highlights, I think that B-roll generally looks best when the motion is smooth and there's not too much camera shake. However, if you've taken the camera off the tripod, you don't have that fluidized tripod head to help you keep your motion smooth. If you have access to a gimbal or something similar, that can help a great deal. We don't have anything like that, so we just have to make do with what we've got. The way that I keep my footage smooth is, first I put on a wider lens, something like this one. And what this does is it means that for the same amount of camera movement, the footage shakes less. Then what I do is I put the camera strap around my neck, and instead of just holding the camera like this, I pull the strap tight. Not too hard, just enough that I have something to push against, and I find that doing that steadies the camera. If I want some camera movement, I'll try to avoid walking with the camera, because if I'm walking, my whole body is jolting up and down, and that's going to translate to a shakier camera. Instead, I just move the camera around while keeping my feet stationary. Sometimes this means that I'll start leaning over to one side and then I'll move over to the other side, which looks really silly, but it helps me keep the camera steady. Another thing that I think can look really good as B-roll is the celebrations and high fives that happen when someone scores. So when you're filming for highlights and someone scores, keep filming. You never know when someone is going to wrap their teammate in a huge hug or lay out for the score, then throw the disc over their shoulder to their teammate who catches it and spikes it on their forehead. It happens all the time. Point is, after someone scores, I like to keep the camera on them and capture their interactions with their teammates because it might make great B-roll. Because we're making a highlight video and B-roll isn't footage of highlights, it can be tempting to think that it's not important. In my opinion, B-roll is very important to a video because it's one way that we can take our video from being a simple montage of highlights to being a complete video. It can be tempting to just sit in a corner with a camera on a tripod and just film the gameplay, but trust me, you'll thank yourselves later when you're editing if you take the camera off the tripod and get some good looking B-roll. Now is probably a good time to talk about being courteous while filming. We're at the fields to make a highlight video, but everyone else is there to either play or to watch Ultimate. And we need to respect that. That means setting up at least 3 meters from the boundary lines so that we don't disrupt the game, making sure that we're not blocking the view of anyone behind us when we film, things like that. Particularly when we're filming B-roll, getting certain shots, like for example this one, means getting close to the players, and we need to be respectful when we're doing that. As an example, it's probably not a great idea to go up and film the post-game huddle of a team that just brutally lost their semi-final. At that stage, they're probably not going to want a camera in their faces. The last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is filming in the rain, which presents its own set of challenges. Unless you have a waterproof camera, you're going to want to keep your camera dry. There are multiple ways of doing that. If there's a sheltered, unobstructed area nearby, that can be a great option. However, more often than not, if it's raining and there's shelter nearby, people tend to congregate under the shelter, so often it can be hard to get an unobstructed view of the field. If it's raining and there's no suitable shelter, you're going to have to stand out in the rain and you're going to have to get wet. To keep the camera dry, we like to use these shroud things that we bought online. They have 4 holes, one for the lens of the camera, one for the tripod, and one on each side for each of your hands. They also have a clear window that we can look through to see the camera screen. As well as that, we like to use a lens hood in the rain, particularly a solid cone one like this rather than the wavy ones. This extra cone around the lens stops rain from hitting the lens directly, which means that we get less rain spots on the lens. One other way that we try to keep water off the camera and off the tripod is by using an umbrella. But we still need 2 hands to operate the camera, so we can't hold the umbrella. So the way that we do things is we put the handle of the umbrella inside our raincoat, which leaves both our hands free to operate the camera. If you have pants with pockets big enough and your umbrella handle is long enough, you can get some extra stability by putting your umbrella handle into one of your pants pockets. If it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid. This does look pretty ridiculous though. If it's raining, it's also useful to have a towel on hand so that we can dry our hands before we handle the camera. It's no good going to all this effort to keep the camera dry only to get water from our hands all over it. One last thing to do when filming in the rain is to keep an eye out for any water in or on your lens. If you get water spots on your lens, make sure you dry it off well to avoid any smears. If your image starts to get hazy or blurry or even foggy, it's probably time to take a break and clean your lens. One time when we were filming in the rain, our footage started to wash out, and this was because we got some moisture in between the UV filter that we were using and the lens itself. After applying some color correction, the footage looked like this, and even then it was almost unusable. I only included the clip in the final video because the highlight was so good. And that's it for this video. We talked about how to pick the best position to film a game, how to track the disc and film everything so that we can be sure we're filming when the highlights happen, how to get creative when filming all of the other stuff that happens around an Ultimate game, the importance of being courteous while filming, and how to keep filming even if the weather decides that being dry is a little overrated. Remember to check out the links in the description to the additional resources and the addendums to this video. I'll see you in the next video, which is the first of 2 where we talk about how we edit our highlight videos.